In Unit 3, Lecture 4, Part 5, we're going to wrap up our discussions on bacterial pathogenesis by looking at how some bacteria can induce autoimmune responses and harm the body that way. So over the last several SoftChalk lessons, we've been looking at virulence factors that damage the host cell. Remember, we looked at how the ability of PAMPs at high amounts can trigger excessive production of cytokines, leading to an excessive inflammatory response, including SIRS, or systemic inflammatory response syndrome. We looked at how some bacteria can produce harmful exotoxins, type 1, type 2, and type 3 exotoxins. And the third way bacteria can cause harm is what we're dealing with in this SoftChalk lesson, the ability to induce autoimmune responses. So autoimmunity is when the body's immune defenses mistakenly attack the body. And sometimes certain bacteria serve as a trigger for that autoimmunity. There aren't a lot of examples of that, but we do have some. Now, one way bacteria can do this is by inducing the production of cross-reacting antibody molecules and possibly autoreactive cytotoxic T lymphocytes produced during cell-mediated immunity. And these antibodies and cytotoxic T lymphocytes made in response to bacterial antigens in some individuals accidentally cross-react with epitopes on our own cells. And so the antibodies and or the cytotoxic T lymphocytes wind up destroying healthy host cells to which they bound by mistake. So what we think happens here is there's a similarity in shape in epitopes where when the body responds by making antibodies or cytotoxic T lymphocytes to react with specific bacterial epitopes, in some individuals those cross-react with epitopes on our own cells because of similarity in structure. And that causes the immune system to attack healthy cells in the body. Furthermore, antibodies can activate the classical complement pathway, and as we saw, that stimulates an inflammatory response, and that can lead to greater tissue damage. Now, for example, rheumatic fever is triggered by rheumatogenic strains of Streptococcus pyogenes, the group A beta strep that cause strep throat. But in certain individuals, when infected with these specific strains of Streptococcus pyogenes, antibodies and possibly cytotoxic T lymphocytes stimulated by the antigens of Streptococcus pyogenes cross-react with heart valve tissue and joint tissue, damaging the heart valves and damaging the joints. The rheuma in rheumatic fever refers to the rheumatism or joint damage, but a greater damage is damage to the heart valves. And prior to days of antibiotics, about 15% of people who got strep throat wound up getting rheumatic fever, and some of those developed rheumatic heart disease. So the mechanisms by which the cross-reacting antibodies and cytotoxic T lymphocytes damage host cells are the same mechanisms they would use to destroy bacteria or tumor cells or virus-infected cells. Sometimes this type of hypersensitivity is called a type 2 hypersensitivity, but we can get opsonization of the cells, you can get MAC lysis of the cells from the complement pathway, ADCC lysis that we'll learn about later on in the unit. So this is just kind of an immunological mistake where antibodies made against bacterial antigens sometimes cross-react with epitopes on host cells, causing the immune system to attack healthy host tissue. Another way autoimmunity can be triggered is by stimulating the production of soluble immune complexes. Immune complexes are antibodies bound to antigens, but in this case, the antigen is a soluble molecule, and it binds to a soluble antibody, and the antigen-antibody complex remains soluble. So when high levels of circulating antibodies react with certain soluble bacterial antigens, they form large amounts of these immune complexes, these soluble antibodies bound to antigens, and these immune complexes wind up lodging in filtering units such as the kidneys, where they activate the complement pathways. And as a result of the inflammatory response induced by the complement pathway, that attracts neutrophils to the area, and as they dump their killing chemicals from the lysosomes with extracellular killing, that can destroy kidney tissue. And an example of that is another post-streptococcal infection called acute glomerulonephritis that sometimes follows infections by Streptococcus pyogenes as well. So the main reason we take Streptococcus pyogenes infection seriously and we treat strep throat or streptococcal wound infection is to prevent the danger of these autoimmune diseases like rheumatic fever, which can sometimes follow strep throat, and acute glomerulonephritis that sometimes follows Streptococcus pyogenes wound infections or skin infections. This is a little GIF animation that kind of shows you what this type 3 hypersensitivity, where you have excessive activation of the complement pathway that can lead to acute glomerulonephritis. So what happens here, we have soluble antibody antigen complexes. The red are the antigens bound to the antibody. And in large amounts, as they diffuse out between the endothelial cells of the capillary, they get trapped against the basement membrane. These antibodies activate the complement pathway. The complement pathway attracts neutrophils, and at high complement levels, they dump their lysosomal contents, destroying the blood vessels and the basement membrane. And that can lead to tissue death and hemorrhaging. A couple other possible examples of bacterial-induced autoimmunity. We think that's some of the problems that occur with chronic Lyme disease. The arthritis, the neurological abnormalities, and the heart damage appear to be autoimmunity followed by infections of Borrelia burgdorferi, the spirochete responsible for Lyme disease. And in tertiary syphilis, the heart damage, the neurological abnormalities, the destructive skin lesions are thought again to be due to autoimmunity to the treponema pallidum, the syphilis spirochete. So as you see, we have a few bacteria that can induce autoimmunity and cause damage. And kind of the classic example of that is rheumatic fever following strep throat. And there's our self-quiz at the end. So that wraps up Unit 3 on bacterial pathogenesis.